Let's do it. You got speed? Hey.
How are you?
How you doing? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Did you know how crazy, the sheer bull goose lunacy that was going to happen the minute you came in here?
Is it possible for you to turn it up slightly?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Real question about the birth certificate.
President Obama, are you listening?
Dealing with the White House is like dealing with a bowl of Jell-O.
I had read enough about the presidential experience through biography to know that you don't know what is going to come at you.
Well, Obama's a socialist. I think he's a Marxist.
He's a radical communist.
I don't think you know until you get here how you're going to respond to all of it. I am not a dictator. I'm the president.
Well, there's got to be kind of a Super Bowl moment when you're like, I know their defense is good. I know they're fast.
Right.
Here we go.
Yeah.
And then they come at you and go, oh, I didn't know that they were that good, that fast, and that big.
The federal government will shut down tonight at midnight Eastern time.
I've always felt, well, this is what you should expect if you're going to be the president of the United States. The one certainty is that there are going to be a lot of responsibilities, and there's going to be a lot of stuff thrown at you.
Don't you see this election and the dysfunction around it as a problem, and that sanity needs to prevail of somebody who knows how to actually get things done?
Sanity didn't prevail in the presidential primaries. And we're not in that cycle. We're not in that zone.
What cycle are we in now?
Craziness. Come on, it's crazy.
And what's going to happen?
The American people are looking at this going, what in the hell happened to America?
A lot of people in this town can never say yes.
Not one Republican will vote for this bill.
I am an antichrist.
I said the sky was blue. They say no.
It's not hope. It's not change. It's partisanship.
I wanna destroy, bomb supply, 'cause
The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally. And it is time for our colleagues across the aisle. Put something on the table. Tell us where you are.
Because of the Ted Cruz Tea Party faction, you're willing to bring this country to its knees.
Stand with us this evening and keep this government going. Hell no, you can't!
many ways to get what you
The White House moved the goalpost.
I've been left at the altar now a couple of times.
When's he going to take responsibility for something? Really? This isn't some damn game.
They're here because our government is tearing apart their families, Madam Speaker.
We came here to do our job. We came here to work.
Radical Islam!
Order, Mr. Speaker.
We are going to Washington, D.C., and we are going to drain the swamp.
A year ago, Vice began making a documentary about the growing dysfunction in Washington and the rise of extreme partisanship that was crippling the government's ability to function. Now, the presidential election of 2016 not only mirrored the hyper-partisanship between the two parties, it magnified it, which in turn fueled the electorate's frustration with our political system's continued paralysis. Now, Donald Trump won a hotly contested and quite frankly weird election that was torn by controversy and scandal, and that became fueled by broad-based anger and disillusionment. This victory, however, actually began its evolution over the past few election cycles. So we met up with the key players from both sides of the aisle to get the inside story on exactly how we ended up where we are today and get a blow-by-blow of the reasons why we remain such a divided country. Now, one of the paradoxes of this election is that President Obama himself is still broadly popular. In fact, his final year approval ratings are among the highest in history. Despite this popularity, however, he knows as well as anyone that the policies he put in place caused deep rifts in the country. So, let's start at the beginning. When you announced your candidacy in Springfield, you said Washington must change. You talked about building consensus, ending petty politics. So 2 terms later, where are we?
Well, that didn't work out, did it? I could not be prouder of the work that my administration's done. But there is no doubt that one of the central goals that I had, which was to make the politics in Washington work better, to reduce the knee-jerk partisanship, to elevate the debate, I haven't accomplished that. This is a humbling job, and so sometimes I say to myself, well, if I'd had the vision and humor of Lincoln, or the charm and persuasiveness of FDR, maybe things would have turned out differently here in Washington. So I'm happy to own that I wasn't able to change attitudes among politicians as well as I would have liked. If people aren't looking to cooperate, if they're not rewarded politically for cooperation, then things can grind to a halt.
That is a really important point I think he says at the end there, is that if they're not rewarded politically. I think this is something that Destiny talks about. And that is that our government is actually working really well at representing the interests of the people. The interests of the people are just really not good right now. And they're also kind of diametrically opposed, when, conservatives are saying, we are not going to certify the election, or, we really, really hate these things. Or when Democrats are pushing from the other end, this is how our country looks. Our country is incredibly divided. So it's no wonder that our legislative representation of the country is also extremely divided.
Yeah, and there's only so much you can do with charm and persuasiveness. And I think Obama's being a little unnecessarily humble there by saying, like, if only I were better at those things. He's exceptionally good at those things, and it still just wasn't enough to overcome the kind of incentive structure that's in place.
Yeah, I was on Wick's show last night as part of the election coverage, and there was someone talking about, these election deniers, they're representing, or Liz Cheney, when she got kicked out, she's like, I'm not representing the will of the people. Why am I getting kicked out? And it's like, okay, that's true, but that is also, with the will of the people is the earth is flat, then you're going to see a whole bunch of, Congress people start saying that the earth is flat one way or another.
Yeah.
President Obama has presided over some of the fiercest partisan fighting that the American political system has ever seen. Congress is gridlocked and has passed fewer laws over the past 8 years than during any other period in modern times. This political stalemate has harmed our international standing, our economy, and even jeopardized our security.
The greatest national security threat to this country at this point is the 2 square miles that encompasses the Capitol building and the White House.
So we wanted to find out how an administration that was supposed to transcend partisanship ended up making it even worse. So we spoke to the decision makers and the advisors who watched it all unfold from the inside, starting with legendary Republican strategist Frank Luntz.
America's top pollster, Frank Luntz.
The famed Republican spin doctor. The man who makes a living on schooling up Republicans on how to win the sound chamber.
What we try to do is bring out what people are actually thinking, not what they might say to you on national television. They forget.
Frank Luntz is a public opinion guru and one of the architects of the Republican strategy to fight President Obama. We joined him for lunch at the Capitol Hill Club, a private haunt for the GOP elite. You have a relationship with Biden, you have a relationship with Obama. Did they have a chance to change the political culture in Washington, and did they lose that chance?
Absolutely. In fact, for me, the most memorable day in politics after the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan was January 20th, 2009. And I got downtown early because I wanted to see how people reacted. I wanted to take this in because it was a very historic day. At least 1 out of 5 people I spoke to did not vote for Obama. but they still wanted to be there. And everybody was in a celebratory mood. This was something special.
We gather because we have chosen hope over fear, unity of purpose over conflict and discord.
He, on that day, had America in his hand, and he could have done what FDR did, completely reshape the national politics. It proceeded to break down within weeks.
Partly because people were purposely trying to make it break down.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that Obama did have a much more broad reach, especially early into his presidency. A lot of people forget how sort of more moderate and conservative really Obama was, especially at the beginning of his presidency, when he was on the campaign trail. I'm also curious, though, I mean, he talks about, the inauguration. I do believe, either at the inauguration or pretty soon within, there were some other crowds in and around the White House that were not very pro-Obama. I think I think that we're going to get to this later, but I mean, the biggest ones would have been the Tea Party protests going into like 2009, 2010, which then I'm sure they get into this, lead to the sort of Tea Party revolution in the 2010 midterms. But yeah, that's a tough one.
Now, as Beyonce serenaded the Obamas for making history, the Republicans were reeling from a devastating defeat. Not only had they lost the White House, but dozens of seats in Congress, falling further into the minority in both the Senate and the House. You talk about the inauguration, but didn't you have a dinner that night with sort of the Republican brain trust of which you're a leading light?
I was just the one who paid the tab. I thought no one was going to show up. And then, in fact, I'd set the table for 24 people. I didn't have enough seats. Everybody came. And you had significant people in that room. You had ranking members of committees. You had 3 or 4 members of the leadership from both the House and the Senate. I mean, you had people like Newt Gingrich, who were the thinkers and philosophers of the party. It was all about a lost movement, trying to figure out how to get back up on his feet.
So what was decided that night?
To challenge when deserved and to cooperate when they should.
So it wasn't to sort of go attack the president from day one, and if Obama's for it, we're against it. It was more,
Never.
What's the new strategy?
Is there a new, not even what's the new strategy?
Is there a new strategy?
Is there a new strategy, or are we done?
Now, while Frank Luntz claims that the party did not pounce on him immediately, right-wing media was not as kind. They attacked the presidency from day one.
Mr. President, I want to believe, I want to trust, I want to hope for change, but I am really failing to see how this is any different.
I shamelessly say no. I want him to fail.
Our country's less safe today.
He's going to bring about socialist democracy.
Is this the change that America voted for?
The Republicans were very shrewd. They were under a lot of pressure with the election of the first African-American president, this kind of kumbaya moment for the country.
Michael Grunwald is a political reporter and best-selling author who covered the turmoil of Obama's first term for Time magazine.
Republicans realized that President Obama had campaigned on bipartisanship. He had promised cooperation, and that they could make him break that promise by not cooperating.
Obama
I don't think I've ever heard it put that way before, but that makes a lot of sense. Like, he promised something that he really couldn't deliver because he had to rely on his opponents to help him deliver it,
Yeah.
and it makes it very easy for them to deny
Yeah, I think that point about the media is a really key one, about how the media sometimes it gets away even from what the politicians, be they on the right or left, want the discourse to be, and that's something they get further into. I saw they had a clip of, oh gosh, I'm not going to be able to remember his name, Rush Limbaugh, who is, of course, I don't know if people watching know this or not, depending upon how old you are, but Rush Limbaugh, that is like the OG, kind of like almost Alex Jones type figure. Maybe definitely not as conspiratorial as Alex Jones, but very much like the right-wing firebrand on the radio.
He's pretty much the guy that popularized conservative right-wing radio.
Yep. And he was like one of the first too that really ignited this movement of, you know, a lot more independent sort of alternative right-wing talking shows and stuff. He like laid the groundwork for that. I believe he passed away from lung cancer a couple of years ago, so he's no longer with us. But he was a hugely important figure in the history of sort of the media covering politics, and I think they're going to get further into that as this goes on.
Financial crisis since the Great Depression. And that was on his administration to fix it.
We learned today American workers were laid off the job last month in numbers not seen in over 3 decades.
People forget that we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. The automobile industry was on the verge of bankruptcy.
Valerie Jarrett, senior advisor to the president and his closest confidant, helped him craft a response to the crisis.
The banks were collapsing. People were seeing their life savings evaporate overnight in their 401ks.
31.8 million Americans applied for food stamps last month, an all-time record.
We were heading towards a Great Depression.
There were moments early on in the presidency when the economy was still cratering, where after a meeting, when I was sitting here alone, I said to myself, there have been times in history where the bottom fell out. And this could be one of those times. There was a bracing sense of, well, this is for keeps, and you better get it right.
We are experiencing a unprecedented, perhaps, economic crisis that has to be dealt with and dealt with rapidly.
Both parties agreed that big steps needed to be taken to stabilize the economy. What they couldn't agree upon, however, was just how much of the stimulus package should be on government spending, which is what the Democrats wanted, and how much should be on tax cuts, which is what the Republicans wanted. Now, an important player in the stimulus discussions was GOP House Minority Leader John Boehner. And we spoke to the man who would later become Speaker of the House at his home in Westchester, Ohio.
The U.S. economy is having the hardest time since the Great Depression. And then the first thing that happens, the first week, is let's get a stimulus package done. Take us back to that time.
Well, my Democrat colleagues in the Congress were pushing the president to expand government spending. But we thought it would be better to give employers incentives to hire more people, to invest in their businesses, to expand the economy that way, because I thought it would be more real and more long-lasting.
This is not our money to spend. We're borrowing this money from our kids.
Despite the gravity of the crisis that was facing the country, this dispute provided rocket fuel to the fire of political partisanship in America.
John Boehner and I and others were invited to the White House, and I remember having come in with sort of a white paper of 5 ideas as to what we Republicans felt should be in the stimulus bill.
Eric Cantor was the House Minority Whip and John Boehner's Chief Deputy.
And I do remember the president taking a look at it and saying, you know, there's really nothing crazy in here, and, you know, we'll take a look at it.
There was a kind of famous confrontation between Obama and Eric Cantor.
We were discussing tax policy, and the president says, Eric, listen, elections have consequences, and I won. So we're going to do it the way that, you know, my administration wants to do it, and I can accept that. But again, there was absolutely no inclusion of anything that we had presented at that point.
Obama had said, hey, look, this stimulus bill has $300 billion in tax cuts, just like you asked. Eric Cantor had complained that some of those tax cuts were refundable, which means that even people who don't make enough money to pay income taxes, even though they pay Social Security taxes and gas taxes and all kinds of other taxes, they would get a tax cut as well as people with bigger tax bills. And that's what President Obama said was non-negotiable. We're not just going to cut taxes for people who aren't poor.
The president listened to the suggestions of all there.
Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, attended key meetings on the stimulus.
Republicans are who they are. They're a trickle-down economics party. We're a party, and the president is, of middle-class economics. There's no surprise that they were consistently for the 1%.
There's no real daylight between the president and Republicans on the Hill. There may be some disagreement over how much spending or how much in the way of tax relief. But at the end of the day, we want him to succeed because America needs him to succeed. Our job was to find the common ground. What could we agree on? What could we do?
But Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's first chief of staff and now the mayor of Chicago, doesn't remember the opposition's motives as being so pure.
While there may be philosophical differences, and that's okay, and there may be ideological differences, and that's politics, there was also an attempt to make an opposition that would not allow his presidency to succeed.
President Obama decided that he was going to do something very unusual. He was going to make the trip to Capitol Hill and go talk to House Republicans about the stimulus bill. Before he even got into the limo, somebody handed him a press release where the Republican leadership had already come out against the stimulus. He said to an aide, "This shit isn't on the level, is it?"
When John Boehner and I had found out that we weren't going to have anything in that bill, we said, well, we're going to oppose the bill.
I don't expect 100% agreement from my Republican colleagues, but I do hope that we can all put politics aside and do the American people's business right now. All right?
The final draft of the stimulus bill provided $288 billion in tax cuts and $499 billion in additional government spending.
Behind the scenes, not only had Republican leadership decided to oppose the bill, but they had decided to whip the entire caucus against it. They wanted a unanimous vote against the stimulus.
Today, the House is expected to approve President Obama's economic stimulus package, but still unclear is how many Republicans might support it.
The House will be in order.
The stimulus ultimately passed without a single Republican vote in the House.
The yeas are 60, the nays are 38.
They got it through the Senate with just a handful of Republican votes.
Senator Lindsey Graham was one of those Republicans who voted no.
And the content of the package was more of the left stream of how to grow the economy than it was a bipartisan product.
To Republicans, those first few weeks of the presidency set the tone for much of what would follow.
What was a real bipartisan moment turned into a partisan fight that sort of tainted the entire first year.
People don't fully appreciate how close we came to a Great Depression as opposed to a Great Recession. And we made some good decisions early that made a difference.
Going out of Ron's office.
The stimulus also showed how Obama was going to handle the presidency.
Have a seat here, Mayor.
After this campaign where everybody had marveled about his brilliant messaging, in office, he's had much more problems selling a bill like the stimulus, which almost instantly became a national joke.
You're going to need a shovel when this bill passes. Not to build anything, just get the money out the door.
Republicans made it sound like just an $800 billion boondoggle.
$200 million to fix up the National Mall. Over $200 million for contraceptives. How is this going to fix an ailing economy?
Some of the provisions they pointed out were real. Some of them were completely made up.
Got me was the honeybee insurance.
$3.4 million for a tunnel in Florida that will let turtles across a highway.
More than $71,000 of stimulus funds are going to a project examining how cocaine affects the brains of monkeys.
A dose of common sense on where this money goes is sorely lacking.
They made it sound like this was $800 billion.
Can we pause for a second? I really hate the common sense talking points. They're so aggravating to me. Like the idea that we can just apply our intuition from everyday life to problems that are just on a completely different scale and of a completely different nature. It's probably good messaging, but it just doesn't actually make any sense.
Yeah, the reality is when you have any sort of project that has this much money, there's going to be money wasted here and there. But the idea that, just going back to that one example, cocaine on monkeys. That's not. Hold on, let me just.
Stimulus funds are going to a project.
Oh, goddammit, come on.
Across the highway.
More than $71,000.
It's like $71,000, man. Really? This is what we're talking about? Like a bill that was for how many hundreds of millions of dollars?
Yeah, I think they said it was like $400 billion of spending, and it's like if you have the time to complain about where 0.01% of that money is going, if you think that's a noteworthy objection to this bill, it's just I don't know. I don't even know what to say to a person whose priorities work that way.
$1,000 of stimulus funds are going to a project examining how cocaine affects the brains of monkeys.
A dose of common sense on where this money goes is sorely lacking.
They made it sound like this was $800 billion worth of honeybee insurance and turtle tunnels and studies of cocaine-addicted monkeys. It was really kind of absurd, the negative tenor of the coverage, while ignoring the sort of larger picture of what the stimulus was doing. Economically, there's just no question that the stimulus did what it was supposed to do. It increased employment by 2 to 3 million jobs compared to the no-action alternative. But it was an extraordinarily unpopular bill.
Now, with opponents of big government still fuming, the president announced a new mortgage assistance program the day after signing the stimulus.
The plan I'm announcing focuses on rescuing families stuck in subprime mortgages they can't afford as a result of skyrocketing interest rates or personal misfortune.
The government, which had already spent billions to bail out the banks, was even more in an attempt to stabilize the economy. But when the president proposed bailing out individual homeowners, the rift between the two parties split even wider and marked a turning point in American politics.
On the Republican side, it really became no more bailouts, no more handouts, no more cop-outs. It became a rejection of the philosophy that put tons of government money, which is your tax dollars, putting that into the economy without any sense of accountability.
The government is promoting bad behavior.
CNBC pundit Rick Santelli responded to the signing from the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange.
This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all... President Obama, are you listening?
How about we all stop paying our mortgage? It's a moral hazard.
We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
Now, this seemingly innocuous rant on daytime TV actually became a rallying cry for the most powerful American political movement in modern history.
Up the revolution! Up the Tea Party!
There are groups around the U.S. who are holding tea parties of their own, protesting massive government spending.
They're fed up with footing the bill for big business, and they want bailouts stopped.
It's a little weird to call them the most powerful movement when they didn't win and were primarily just like an opposition force to the to the sitting government.
Yeah, maybe not the most powerful, but definitely one of the most important, just in terms of, the wrenches that they threw. I'm sure they're going to get into this with the 2010 midterms and just going forward in the Obama presidency. And a lot of that is sort of the roots you see of the sort of more populist side of the Republican Party today, and then obviously in 2016. I'm reminded of when Frank Luntz was talking earlier about the meeting he had after Obama won at the diner. And he started talking, we felt like a lost movement and stuff. And I kind of feel like Republicans are still like that to this day, to a certain degree. It feels like the Republican Party never recovered from 2008 in the sense of there's never been a cohesive idea of what the Republican Party is since then. They're still trying to figure that out even now. People talk all the time about the battle for the soul of the Republican Party in terms of for Trump versus anti-Trump. But going back even earlier, it seems pretty clear that there was a real disconnect of they weren't sure what to believe anymore, or what a cohesive ideology that would unite the party would look like.
Yeah, the Democratic Party, in contrast, has never been particularly cohesive, or at least not for the maybe not since the FDR era, but it's always just been this loose coalition of minority interests that are there to oppose the conservative majority, basically. But yeah, I get what you mean about the Obama presidency is probably as close to anybody's come to uniting the Democratic Party.
Yep.
And
certainly in modern time.
Yeah. And then so I think you could make a not crazy case that Trump did something equivalent, but it's still a stark contrast to somebody like a Ronald Reagan or whatever who was just
and Trump was able to get a lot of conservatives out to vote, but in terms of actually unifying a party, I mean, he definitely didn't do that. There's a ton to this day of people that are anti-Trump that have been kicked out of the party. The only people left that are are going to be openly anti-Trump, are people like Ben Shapiro, who I get a lot of respect for Ben Shapiro, but the reality is he's just kind of I think he just kind of downplays. I think he's like, yeah, I don't really like Trump that much, but let's talk about fentanyl. Let's talk about libs of TikTok and this kind of stuff. It isn't the case that Ben Shapiro is waging a war against the Trump faction of the Republican Party, which I think is part of the reason why he's still around. If he really was, then I think he probably wouldn't be very popular in these conservative circles anymore.
Yeah, and Trump really is not a very ideological figure anyway. So the people that do support him, it's usually not so much that they like his ideas and the direction he wants to. It's more like,
yeah.
I'd say the primary appeal of Trump is that the left hates him and they're trying to trigger the libs.
It's very much an aesthetic appeal, which is why you see even in the Trump camp the divide between the more true populist Steve Bannon types and the more Jared Kushner types that are just trying to make some shit happen. You see Tucker Carlson, I think, would be one of the better examples of a true-blooded populist who's actively trying to convert the Republican Party and your rank-and-file conservatives into populists that are skeptical of elites and institutions and the idea of those things in and of themselves. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and you see a lot of those roots all the way back here in the Tea Party movement that starts kicking off.
Yeah, and Trump himself was kind of loosely associated with it too.
Yeah,
he was
birtherism.
The birtherism thing, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's just wild. The active president of the United States from 2016 to 2020 had spent years and years talking about how the previous president was born in Kenya. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up.
And then how he wanted to lock up his opponent and all this.
Yeah.
Now, conservative ideas, they want this country to be ran by the country, not by the government.
It may be the biggest political movement in years.
Now, over the coming months, polls showed that up to 30% of Americans identified with the growing Tea Party movement, giving it even more power to disrupt business as usual in Washington.
There would have been no Tea Party movement without the first 2 years of Barack Obama. It was a complete backlash against an overreach by the government. So you had the stimulus package where people went back to their districts and Republicans were saying this is big government run wild, followed by Obamacare. And this became sort of the blow-up of all blow-ups.
Now, with the Democrats in control of both the House and the Senate, President Obama had the numbers in Congress to pursue another big goal that had eluded many presidents before him: universal health care.
All right, let's go. Let's start with legislative. Phil, health care is the next 3 weeks of commitment.
But even within the president's inner circle, advisors warned that it could be political suicide.
Hey guys, how are you?
If you looked at every president since Teddy Roosevelt who campaigned
What a
on
great
national
picture.
healthcare, they either walked out empty-handed or they had to scale back to a different form of healthcare.
Now, Rahm Emanuel's caution was based on his own experience 16 years earlier.
I was in the Clinton White House and I was working on the crime bill then.
In 1993, the president had put then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton in charge of reforming the healthcare system.
It's time to bring about fundamental change, control our nation's soaring healthcare costs, and provide security for American families again.
An effort that went up in flames, nearly derailing the Clinton presidency and tarnishing Hillary Clinton's legacy to this day.
Health insurance reform cannot be enacted this year.
It's something that people in theory want until you're reorganizing a lot of furniture. And, that's a big threat to people. So said, look, you've got to understand that this is going to be, from the moment you announce it, a huge suck of both time, energy, and political capital, with a chance of success that narrows with every day.
While the battle to pass the stimulus bill lasted 1 month, the battle to pass healthcare reform would take more than a year of intensely partisan politics played out both on the floor of Congress and in the press.
I've had the good fortune of being able to work on a lot of stuff, but there is no question the most difficult, elusive, thing I've ever worked on was Obamacare.
There has been some talk that we're in the midst of an economic crisis and that the system is overloaded, and so we should put this off for another day. There is always a reason not to do it, and it strikes me that now is exactly the time for us to deal with this problem.
Obamacare was the most visible example of the giant divide breaking apart even further. To the left, this whole idea of having some national health care plan goes back 100 years. And then to your average Republican, this idea that all these decisions are going to be made in Washington about what my health care looks like, it was like dropping a stick of dynamite in a small crevice in the earth.
All we're going to do is raise taxes and increase.
I love Boehner's colorful language. Sometimes he really like for you guys who weren't around paying attention to politics during that era. That thing that Boehner just did, where he it's trying to make this analogy to dynamite. That's just a very John Boehner thing to say. He's constantly making up ridiculous analogies for things. I really enjoy him.
So much time trying to discredit the program.
Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn was the House Majority Whip and led the fight for many of the reforms featured on the Obamacare bill.
What we fail to do is to be as vigilant. They don't care what the truth is. All they care about is winning the issue.
Taxes on individuals, taxes on small business owners, taxes on businesses making inadvertent filing errors.
He just portrayed it as big government, big taxes, big spending.
This bill is a fiscal Frankenstein. It's a government takeover.
Government takeover. Government takeover. Government takeover of healthcare.
The Republicans did a really excellent job of not only mobilizing their base to oppose Obamacare, but of dominating the public debate about Obamacare.
We do not need socialized medicine of any type. We need to have freedom of choice.
Now, during Congress's summer break, Democratic members went home to rally support for the bill, but they were totally unprepared for what awaited them in their respective districts. A full-on revolt against the bill at a grassroots level. Now, at the center of the controversy was a deep-seated fear that it would lead to so-called socialized medicine and the rationing of health care.
I don't think I'd last long under a government health care plan as I get older. Because of this rationing, it is bound to happen.
Meaning that the government would actually decide who should live and who should die.
When people began to read and hear about the fact that Washington was going to change their health care, they got very upset.
80% of us recognize the anti-constitutionality of this health care. This is anarchy!
Members of Congress are back home holding town hall meetings. And in meeting after meeting, there's been a pattern of disruption.
Somehow it's both tyranny and anarchy. Makes perfect sense.
This healthcare bill to me is very scary because I know what happened in Germany under Hitler.
Now, the opposition to the Affordable Care Act became so heated that President Obama called for a special session of Congress just to defuse the situation.
Some of people's concerns have grown out of bogus claims spread by those whose only agenda is to kill reform at any cost. The best example is the claim made not just by radio and cable talk show hosts, but by prominent politicians, that we plan to set up panels of bureaucrats with the power to kill off senior citizens. Now, such a charge would be laughable if we weren't so cynical and irresponsible. It is a lie, plain and simple.
But the fury that had swept through the country had emboldened the president's critics in Congress, especially those who thought the law would promote abortion and give free health care to illegal immigrants.
The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally.
South Carolina Republican Joe Wilson shouted out to the president in Congress, "You lie," and it immediately made him a conservative celebrity.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Joe Wilson!
Now, while he was formally rebuked by Congress, Wilson became a hero to the growing ranks of the Tea Party for daring to shout down the president from the House floor for the first time in modern history. But Vice President Biden remembers the episode as a new low in partisan friction.
I think it was a confirmation of how off track relationships have gotten between the political parties. When you attack another man's judgment, hammer and tong, you can still reach a consensus. You can still work something out. But when you attack his character or her character, when you attack their motive, then it's almost impossible to get to yes.
Poisoning the well.
And that's one of the things that has changed so negatively in American politics in all my years over the last 10 years in American politics. And it's dangerous.
This bill is the greatest threat to freedom that I have seen in the 19 years I've been here in Washington.
You were quoted as saying that Obamacare was the greatest threat to America. Why is that?
It's set up as a social welfare program. It's not set up as an insurance program that has reserves and has backing, and so it's fundamentally unsound.
We are committed to making sure that not one Republican will vote for this bill.
With the atmosphere in Washington becoming increasingly toxic, President Obama took an extraordinary step. He headed to the House Republicans' annual retreat to face down their criticism directly on live television. And Frank Luntz was in the audience. In fact, he called you out. What happened there?
Barack Obama wanted to address them, and House Republicans wanted to hear from him.
You know what they say, keep your friends close, but visit the Republican caucus every few months.
And both sides thought that this would be good for each other, and just maybe you'd be able to get something done. And it didn't work out that way.
If you were to listen to the debate, and frankly how some of you went after this bill, you'd think that this thing was some Bolshevik plot.
So he's about 25 feet away, and he's going through his answers to some of the hostile Republican questions, and he's getting hostile himself.
No. Hold on a second, guys. You know, Mike, I've read your legislation. I take a look at this stuff. It can't be all or nothing one way or the other.
And I'm taking notes to be able to present to House Republicans how to respond to what Obama just said.
And unfortunately, that's how our politics works right now. That's how a lot of our discussion works.
And I see him kind of do a shuffle. He says, you know what?
You know, I see Frank Lutz up here sitting in the front. He's already pulled it. And he said, you know, the way you're really going to, I've done a focus group, and, you know, the way we're going to really box in Obama on this one.
And my computer's got notes on it, and he's coming at me, and so I just casually put the screen down.
I like Frank. We've had conversations between Frank and I, but that's how we operate. It's all tactics, and it's not solving problems. All right, thank you, everybody.
When the thing was over, he went and shook hands. And I came over to the line, and we talked for a couple seconds.
Pollster Frank Luntz called out by President Obama.
And every news outlet picked it up and ran it. And they did so because how often do you have a strategist for the other side talking to the president? It just doesn't happen in Washington. Right. And that's one of the problems. The moment you get to Washington, there's a red side and a blue side, and there is nobody in the middle.
Right. This became a very ideological battle.
Now, the president's visit failed to break the logjam in Congress, and the campaign to pass the bill dragged into its 11th month.
The American people want us to scrap this bill.
Now, in reality, the public was almost evenly split about the Affordable Care Act. But in American politics, the voices of the opposition are almost always louder and more intense. And the Republicans were able to rally their base for a vicious fight against the bill.
Over the last 2 days, human beings who happen to be members of Congress have been called the N-word, have been spat on. Just recently, someone asked me why my braids were so tight.
The yeas are 220, the nays are 211. The bill is passed.
I don't think there's any question
that the Affordable Care Act is our proudest boast. It stands right there with Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as a pillar of economic health security for America's families. It's a giant accomplishment.
Health care is not a privilege, but a right. Every American is entitled to have health care. It's a gigantic step forward.
Something that I don't think this really gets into is a big part of Obamacare, I think, was realizing, because Obama definitely came in as a much more moderate candidate, but realizing that he had the opportunity, once in a lifetime with the Democratic majorities necessary to really get through something quite significant. It almost reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with Star Citizen.
Is it a video game?
Yeah.
Is that the one that's been in beta for like 10 years or something? Is that one? Okay.
Yeah, and it has something like $100 million or some ridiculous number of crowdfunding. But basically, the story of Star Citizen, at least in my view, is that it gets criticized a lot for having taken way longer to come out. And it's like, oh, you gave them $200 million, and now you could buy ships for like $100,000, as in the supporter package and stuff. And I think what really happened is the guys at Star Citizen wanted to make this game. They got all this funded, and they realized, we have a chance here to do something that no video game company almost ever has a chance to do, which is an unlimited budget, no producer, no publisher that's going to come in over our heads and make us cut down our dreams. We can make the greatest, we can make the true space simulator game where you can do everything you can do in space.
This is
and
the trap
we're going to go for it.
This is the trap that George Lucas fell into with the prequels.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very similar thing where you have to realize, man, I've got a chance here to do. I didn't, this wasn't our original plan, but god damn it, if I don't do this now, no one's ever going to do it for another 60, 70 years. So fuck it, let's go for it. And I think that's a real part of sort of why Obamacare came so out of left field, and part of why there was a big backlash, because Obama was a lot more conservative than Obamacare would suggest.
With Star Citizen, I feel like there's a pretty easy answer to what they should have done with that opportunity, though, which is first just get it up and running and then patch in more stuff later, But with Obamacare, probably not going to work.
Yeah, I think the issue with Star Citizen is a lot of that is sort of the mythical man hour. They've got the team now. They want to start working on it. And that's also the case. They want to set a good foundation. It's hard to patch in, the whole universe on top of the game as opposed to vice versa.
Thank you, everybody.
It's not yet universal healthcare, although we've gotten 20 million people healthcare, and we've done so in a way that promises to ensure even more in the future. I think about it as a pretty good starter home, the same way that Social Security, when it started, was imperfect, or Medicare and Medicaid, when they started, were imperfect, but over time were improved and eventually became bedrock social welfare programs that everybody relies on.
Now, Democrats celebrated the bill's passage as an historic achievement. But for Republicans, it only solidified the idea that government was out of control.
The biggest change in healthcare in generations. I think it's been a miserable failure. And right now, it still to this day lingers over the body.
The stimulus bill passed, the Obamacare legislation passed. But honestly, these are big, big pieces of legislation with policy implications, all passing without any Republican votes. So I do think that gave impetus to the Tea Party. It was sort of this sense that the government had grown too big, taking too much of taxpayers' money. And I believe that the electorate in 2010 wanted some balance.
And as the Tea Party mustered its forces,
the other thing to mention is that this is a big outlet for a lot of the sort of anti-establishment sentiment that had been brewing on both sides under the Bush administration. I mean, the reason why it was McCain versus Obama in 2008 is because McCain was the maverick. He was the outsider. And, he ended up actually picking up Sarah Palin in part to try and whip up the core of the Republican base that didn't really like him very much from his years of him not being, a mainline Republican. And now a lot of these Republicans who have a lot of, anti-establishment sentiment as well, have an outlet that is left-wing. So you see a big outpouring of that. I think that's another big part of this. It's almost the Republicans' time to get their Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, so I guess in a way it's almost like you're framing it as this is like fallout from the kind of perceived failure of the neocon era. Yeah.
I think that's definitely part of it, and specifically the George Bush administration with sort of the double whammy of 9/11 and the wars that came with it, along with the financial crisis. I think a lot of our politics is still defined by those two events and everything that followed them. I mean, in reality, it's a lot more than just two events, but those two central happenings that then bled into all these other things. You know, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the financial crisis, the bailouts. I think it's established a sentiment of where the default position is to be very, skeptical of our institutions and elites and things like these, and it just poisons our politics. I'll have, arguments with people where it's like, well, you should really get the vaccine, and they're like, oh, the vaccine's safe? You mean how, like, there were WMDs in Iraq? And it's like, oh my god, what are you talking about? These are, like, not even tangentially related in terms of, like, the authority of who speaks to them.
Is that like somebody really said that exact thing to you, or?
Yeah.
What? All right.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I remember, like, Alex Jones was kind of doing his thing for a long time before he came to prominence. Like he had been like a conspiracy theory radio host since the 1990s, and he was just like a small time laughing stock back then. But then you could see, like,
but then he was replaced by Bill Hicks secretly, and then the elites gave him the go ahead.
Right.
Take on the Democrats in the 2010 midterm elections, they had a powerful new weapon, a massive change in the way elections are financed.
2010 was about big money following the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. That unleashed endless special interest, dark, unreported money into the campaigns.
The Supreme Court decision, called Citizens United, had come down earlier in the year, and it ruled that political contributions are a form of free speech, and that outside groups could spend as much money as they wanted to influence elections. And that gave rise to what are called super PACs. And one of the most active super PACs is American Crossroads, founded by Republican strategist Karl Rove and run by Stephen J. Law.
It's interesting, a lot of people don't know that the bill, just speaking of McCain, the bill that previously had governed campaign finance laws that was sort of overturned by the Citizens United decision was the McCain, oh gosh, I'm not going to remember, but it was...
Feingold, I think?
Yes, McCain-Feingold, yep, that's it, the McCain-Feingold bill. That was... whose initial co-sponsors were Feingold for the Democrats and McCain for the Republicans. It's just one of those things where you really start to see the same names turn up over and over and over again throughout American politics. There's a shot earlier where I believe you could see, who was the first Attorney General under Trump? The old bastard who hated weed.
Was it Jeff Sessions?
Yes, Jeff Sessions. There's a shot earlier where Obamacare, where when Obama was running to the "You Lie" comment, you can see Mike Pence and Jeff Sessions sitting next to each other in the House.
What distinguishes us from other players in the political sphere is we're able to raise money in unlimited amounts from individuals and companies and associations. We started out in early 2010. We had one contribution that got the doors open, and over the course of the next 27 weeks, we raised $71 million. The largest part of our budget, probably 70% of what we spend, goes on communicating with voters on television or cable.
They have failed Missouri, and Robin Carnahan is one of them. Carnahan stands with Obama's health care law.
Obamacare summed up in a lot of voters' minds everything that they didn't like about what was going on in Washington. They saw it as partisan. They saw it as big government. It just created this desire to get back at the people who had done this to the country.
Another big part of that big government, anti-big government sentiment is also going to be coming from the bailouts. That, were just sort of lightly touched on by this documentary because it's not the focus, but god damn were those bailouts unpopular. I mean, they were really, really just not popular with anybody. The idea of, the government going and, bailing out these big corporations, from a left-wing perspective, I mean, that just seems like a huge wealth transfer. And from a right-wing perspective, it seems like government interfering with, the economy as it should. These big businesses made bad decisions, so let them fail. And also, came off as very much like a sort of elitist transfer of wealth, I think, even from the right-wing perspective, which is how you start to see this sort of bipartisan almost sense of populism start to grow.
Yeah, so let me point out while we're on that topic, this is, brought to me the documentary about the bailouts and the 2008 financial crisis a few months ago, and we were covering that, and I think an important point that you were making when we were talking about that was that a lot of these bailouts were like loans that got paid back, and then the government actually like net gained money off of it. So.
Yeah, no one knows that we made, I think it's like $109 billion on TARP, that, these were loans that had to be paid off. And it's also just, people just don't appreciate how unbelievably fucked it would have been if these did go under. I think Obama says it best when he says a lot of people don't appreciate how close we were. If those financial institutions start failing, you can say goodbye to, every car company in the country that relies on people getting loans to buy their cars. You can say goodbye to all the companies that rely on any sort of financial assistance in order to pay their things over time. The housing market was already bad. It would have gone even further underground at that point. Who even knows what starts to happen to some of the mortgages that are owned by banks at that point. It really could have been Armageddon. There's I feel like there's a deep disappreciation for like finance, the financial sector, and the complexities of it and how it helps the country run. It's kind of like the thing, I feel like people always are sometimes, love to make jokes about lawyers and how they hate lawyers. Lawyers are so bad and stuff. It's like, man, if you did not have lawyers, son, like you would not like the situation you'd be living in. You didn't have these people that dedicate a lot of time to answering really hard questions about like our legal system and holding up the procedure. I think I've referenced this before. There's a great movie called Margin Call where it's this movie basically set in a hedge fund that realizes the 2008 financial crisis is about to happen, and so they sell everything. And like in the story, they're sort of the ones who kick it all off. And there's this great line where one of the hedge fund guys is talking to one of the other hedge fund guys, and he says, everyone wants it to be fair. I've got my hand on the scale, and everyone says they want fairness, but they don't. I take my hand off the scale, things start to get really fucking fair really fucking quick, and no one wants that. Hand on the scale, it's fine, but I take my hand off, Armageddon. And he has this, and just talking about how, I think people like the life they have. They like to say that they want fairness and stuff like this, but I think in reality, most people want, nice lives, and the nice lives that we live don't exactly work off of, this laissez-faire capitalism approach that is, totally devoid of any sort of like the great example would be like, farming subsidies, this great contradiction, and even in conservative America, where we're just dumping tons of money into this stuff. He's got another line where he says, if we're right about this thing, they'll villainize us because they'll say, oh, we're just hedge funds making money, but if we're wrong, they'll call us the biggest fucking pussies on earth for not holding and making more money.
And on the fairness thing, I whenever people bring that up, I always tend to think fairness is just whenever an authority figure acts in a way that you disapprove of. It's
No to Obama, Pelosi, Reid. Say no to Robin Carnahan. American Crossroads is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Now, the 2010 election was the first since this new ruling. An outside group spent nearly $310 million to influence its outcome, which is almost 5 times what outside groups had spent during the previous midterm election. Much of that money went to support candidates aligned with the Tea Party.
We have a big story to report tonight. Republicans have won control of the House of Representatives.
Sweeping, stunning Republican victories all across the country.
On Election Day, Republicans trounced the Democrats and handed the GOP control of the House.
Voters that went to the polls tonight sent a message to Barack Obama.
Man, it's a good thing we're watching this after the election where that didn't happen. That'd be kind of awkward. I'm not going to lie.
It was the worst loss for Democrats in more than 50 years.
Some election nights are more fun than others. Some are exhilarating. Some are humbling.
Now, this election marked a pivotal moment in the presidency, because from this point on, President Obama would face obstruction in Congress more intense than he'd ever experienced.
God bless you, Speaker Boehner.
And John Boehner, who had been minority leader, became the face of the opposition as the newly installed Speaker of the House.
By this point, the partisan tensions between the Republican majority in the House and the White House, it was pretty serious.
In 2010 election, you have the rise of the Tea Party.
Correct.
But even as the Republicans celebrated their newfound power, there was growing dissent within its ranks because of the new infusion of hyper-conservative Tea Party members. Now, a key player in this new force on Capitol Hill was Congressman Raul Labrador, co-founder of the powerful Freedom Caucus, a main bastion of the Tea Party's strength in Congress.
There were a lot of people here who had not been in government before, We really believed when we came here that we were coming to change Washington, D.C. And one of the first fights that we had in Congress was the spending fight.
With their newly won majority in the House, Republicans created a new mechanism to exert control.
We put in place a rule requiring there to be a separate vote on the increase in the debt ceiling of the country.
Now, the debt ceiling is the routine authorization for America to borrow money to pay its bills. And if the ceiling isn't raised when needed, the government ceases to be able to pay its debts, which in turn means, quite simply, it ceases to be able to function, which is why it's always been raised as a matter of routine.
Speaker Boehner had also a lot of worries that he wasn't going to be able to control this new raucous caucus of his, of Tea Party fiscal conservatives.
Jay Newton Small is a Washington correspondent at Time magazine and reported extensively on the brewing crisis.
It was a way of satisfying his fiscal conservatives, right? Here we're going to cut a ton of money from the federal budget, potentially trillions of dollars.
I made clear in early 2011 when I became Speaker that we were not going to raise the debt ceiling without doing something about our spending problem.
Right.
And secondly, I made pretty clear to the President that the best time to do big things is when you have divided government. We got a Republican House, we've got a Democrat in the White House. Both parties have their fingerprints on the deal.
In June of 2011,
Can
Speaker
we pause
Boehner
for a
began
second?
meeting privately with President.
That's a really interesting point that Boehner's making there. It's usually it's completely reversed from the way that I would usually think of it, which is that if you have divided government, then the parties are just going to like oppose each other and completely obstruct each other from doing anything, and therefore it would be like the worst time to do anything. But it's an interesting point to the idea that any accomplishment you do make, they can both take credit and both take blame for, and I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a very admirable view that is very not true anymore. Going forward, it feels like. It's funny. This is what Joe Manchin was talking about when he opposed the voting rights. I believe it was the John Lewis voting rights bill. He said if something this important, how we vote, is going to go through, it needs to be approved by both parties. Or else, if it's something this foundational, that needs to be something that, not just a slim majority approves of, but a healthy, majority, and people from different groups. And I think it's a very admirable thought. But John,
if only it would actually happen. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is that people, there's always going to be unestablishment, because of who holds the presidency. So as a result, there's always going to be one side who has this incentive to just, shit all over anything that tries to happen and stop it dead. There's just a real inability in terms of the political incentives to create good good systems of behavior, where there is an incentive to be selfless or to be a good statesman and do something that might not, personally benefit your party, but still good for the health of the country. Theoretically, that should be politically beneficial because people would care, but they don't.
President Obama to negotiate what became known as the Grand Bargain.
I went down to the White House and snuck into the White House. I couldn't walk in because you walk into the White House, the right-wing press goes, "Oh, what's he up to?"
Right.
The left-wing press, "Oh, what's the president up to?" Everybody goes crazy. The president and I end up in the Oval Office, and it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock, and I said, "Hey, boss, why don't we go outside on that patio outside here that Reagan had built?" And we're having a conversation about this budget deal that we've been trying to put together. I look up at one point, and I'm smoking a cigarette, drinking a glass of red wine. I look across the table, and here's the president, drinking iced tea and chomping on Nicorette. It's just one of those moments that you really just can't make up.
Now, partisan politics in Washington had become so vitriolic that not only did the Speaker of the House have to actually sneak into the White House, but that just by speaking to the president, he was immediately seen as tainted by his own party.
What I always had a problem with is that whenever he had these secret meetings with the President of the United States, it was to negotiate something that wasn't even related to what we were discussing in the Republican conference.
People were sniping at me from every direction. My staff even came to me and said, "Boehner, you're risking your speakership. You're risking your job here by continuing these conversations."
By July 9th, Boehner realizes that His Tea Party core is never going to go along with this. And finally, Boehner withdraws.
But with the August 2nd deadline approaching, the White House succeeded in bringing the Republican leadership back to the negotiating table.
They bring in Cantor this time, and Obama really is going after Cantor in the Oval Office.
Asked the president if we could at least bank the savings that we had already come to an agreement with. He took a real offense at that and really just said he shouldn't have to spend all his time working with members of Congress. We should be able to do this and without him, and walks out of the room.
My relationship with all the leaders has been cordial. It has been professional. But I think at a certain point, the American people run out of patience. If they think that people are playing games and not serious in terms of solving problems.
I did everything I could to push the president to do the grand bargain. It was a long, slow process over many months of discussions.
And you were nearly there.
And we were there. The president, myself, Eric Cantor, on a Sunday morning, stood in the Oval Office, shook hands, the deal was done.
2 days later, the Gang of Six happens.
The good news is that today, a group of senators, the Gang of Six, put forward a proposal that is broadly consistent with the approach that I've urged.
So the president and the Republicans had finally reached a deal. But at the last minute, the so-called Gang of Six came up with an agreement of their own. It threw the process into confusion, and the Republicans were unable to get their party back to the table. It became a perfect portrait of just how dysfunctional Washington had become.
Now let me just say that the White House moved the goalpost.
But according to Clyburn in the White House, Speaker Boehner was placing false blame.
I was right there in the middle of it, and I never missed a single meeting. No goalposts were moved at all.
Good evening, everybody. It is hard to understand why Speaker Boehner would walk away from this kind of deal.
The train had just gone off the cliff, and everybody was blaming everybody.
Dealing with the White House was like dealing with a bowl of Jell-O.
Can they say yes to anything?
There was an agreement.
I've been left at the altar now a couple of times.
The president demanded $400 billion more.
We have now run out of time.
Washington's gridlock was now affecting the financial reputation of the United States.
The numbers are not pretty. The Dow fell below 11,000 today after Standard & Poor's downgraded America's credit rating for the first time in history.
Losing America's AAA rating was a signal to the world that the U.S., for the first time in its history, had become a risky investment.
It still may come down to this, a last chance option from the Senate's top leaders.
Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell basically negotiate this bill, which essentially punts the can. Here's the amount of money that they need to offset to get this bill through the House. There was so much unhappiness, so much mistrust. It was just this utter failure.
One of the hardest things about being president is you're cooped up, the proverbial bubble. I think Bill Clinton said this was the crown jewel of the federal penitentiary system. And this is my yard. And every night I'll walk with my chief of staff and we'll talk about issues. And if nothing else, being president gives you perspective. It gives you historic perspective because you go through a week and there's a mass shooting and there's an international crisis and there's an outbreak of disease somewhere, and you say to yourself, this is tough, this is challenging, this is bad, but we can solve this, we can figure this out. Obviously, a lot of that's experience, and you've been around the track, and you've seen big highs and big lows. I have confidence in my ability to deal with just about anything. More importantly, I have confidence in this country's ability to deal with just about anything.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Despite all the frustrations of Washington, I've never been more hopeful about our future.
Now, you might think that Obama's re-election in 2012 would have eased some of the tensions in Washington because he won by a healthy margin and therefore had a so-called mandate of the people.
And we remain more than a collection of red states and blue states. We are and forever will be the United States of America.
I always joke, America might have done it by accident the first time, but You know, they had seen me for 4 years, and I got reelected, so.
However, despite the president's popularity, Republicans also retained their majority in the House, with even more seats going to the Tea Party, which meant that the polarization already happening in Congress was about to get even worse.
Now you've had two classes of Tea Party members, and they were much more intractable.
I think the Tea Party movement was welcomed by Republicans initially. Then it turned kind of dark.
What we learned when we got here is that Washington doesn't change that quickly. And in fact, it's not so much the Democrats that don't want it to change. It's actually the establishment of the Republican Party.
The rhinos. Come on, man. You need a more honest answer about that. The reason why Washington, at least in my humble opinion, doesn't change is because there's good reasons why it works this way. You can't just come in and expect to change the entire system when there's a bunch of people that disagree with you, that like the current system how it is. The reason it works, in terms of with an establishment bias, is because reality is most people like their lives. There's good reasons why they have personal relationships are so key to working out this legislation, because ultimately it's humans trying to work with humans over bills that they don't have a lot of technical expertise of. Of course, it's going to be, a much more sort of humanistic, almost like social negotiation than anything else. This is a very common attitude, we're going to go in and change the way Washington works, and no one ever wants to grapple with, I think, the more difficult truth that is that Washington works pretty well at what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, the system was designed to be kind of slow-moving, with the idea that if there's a really big problem, then hopefully we'll be able to form a consensus around it. And if there's, if no consensus is formed, then probably things are going okay. Unfortunately, that's not really the way that people perceive it, because even though we do, we don't have any big enough problem for us to form a consensus around it, people are still, unhappy with the many smaller problems that we do disagree
And there's
about.
a huge inability as well to, I think, grapple, or not inability, there's a huge there's just a bunch of bullshit that also circulates about, the quality of this, the idea of, I think lobbying, for example, is a really big boogeyman on both sides that people try to use to explain why people don't like them, why people don't, want to agree with them. Why do the Democrats support the vaccine and stuff? It's the big pharma, it's paying them all off, they're making a bunch of money. Why don't Republicans support healthcare? It's a big pharma again, but this time going the other direction. There's always this this desire to look for reasons why you aren't getting the thing you're getting that's anything other than people don't agree with you. It's funny when I was on.
It's like the people against the big bad boogeyman elites, basically. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I was just talking last night on Wick's show about the election stuff, and it was Lactoid who was sort of opining about how it seems that he had, and a lot of conservatives had overestimated the number of people that actually supported abortion bans, and how he thought that was going to be a big win for Republicans, but instead it's something they can't really point to because there's people that don't support it. I was almost smiling to myself because I was like, oh my God, he's describing, you replace the proper nouns and he's a Bernie bro talking about Medicare for all. I can't believe that, more Democrats don't actually support this kind of thing. It was really fascinating.
I think the Bernie Bros are less realistic about it, though, because they seem to have this idea that, really everyone secretly supports our policy positions, but they've just been fooled into voting for them.
This is a really big, brain rot position, I think, that's very common in sort of, the Justice Dem circles of, the left wing. People like Kyle Kalinske. I mean, Kyle Kalinske will say, politics is an easy game that we make difficult. It's already easy. Everyone already agrees with us. We just got to tell them that. All those, Kyle Kalinske literally has quotes talking about all those, policy wonks in Washington getting paid millions of dollars. They're useless. They don't do anything. All we got to do is just get to the people. Or the idea that it's just propaganda is keeping these right wingers from coming and enjoying the benefits of democratic socialism and stuff like this. It's a real problem, I think.
It's funny to have that position and then also think that the solution to it is to do better propaganda.
Yeah, it's the Justice Dems, I don't agree with all of the things they say, but hey, I mean, that's the beauty of our system, right? The funny thing is, at this point, is it's one of those things where it's like you hate to admit that the person is right. You know, it's like talking to some, you know, all the right wingers in 2016. They were talking about, oh, you know, this woke stuff's gone too far. It's like, hold on. And now it's like, okay, it's definitely gone too far in certain respects. You know, I hate that these left wing people are making these right wingers right. And yeah, exactly opposite direction. I hate that some of these right wingers, and I'm making Kyle Kalinske. It's like Kyle Kalinsche's like, oh, Republicans don't actually believe anything. They're just victims of propaganda. It's like, no. There's real arguments for limited government. You know, it's like a philosophical position. There's a real argument. And then they're like, right Republicans are like, yeah, that's why Joe Biden stole the election. It's like, okay, well, shit. Maybe Kyle Kalinske has a little bit of a point when he talks about the propaganda just rotted people's brains.
And you know, when people are right about things like that, it makes me think though that like what they're probably noticing is actually a broader feature of human psychology, right? Because like the ability to be swayed in that way is not unique to one party or the other. And if
100%.
you know, if Republicans can be, you know, moved to support candidates on grounds that are silly or fraudulent or whatever, it you know, that then all of us are probably on some level susceptible to the same thing.
Yep.
There was a few of us who decided that no, we were not going to just follow and obey. We were actually going to try to change the way things were happening here.
Now, the Tea Party's experience with the debt ceiling standoff had proven to them that there were weapons they could use if they were willing to go to the extreme.
I intend to speak in support of defunding Obamacare until I am no longer able to stand.
So they decided to use the same tactics they had used before, but this time go even further.
Ted Cruz had this idea we could shut down the government and force the president to repeal and replace Obamacare. Really? And all my colleagues were talking about it. They had ginned this up on talk radio. Their constituents were talking about it. They had been led to believe this is a winning strategy.
When the government shut down, it means that
I think that, sorry, I just want to go back to that picture there. I think I've been in this tunnel, actually. This is the tunnel that goes underneath the Capitol and crosses a couple of streets, actually. It's a way for Congress people to get in and out of the Capitol without having to sort of go through the rigmarole of the actual streets outside. It's really fascinating. It's almost like this, it's almost like a mall. Like the hallway of a mall. It's like this big sort of like just like walkway underground. There's like metal detectors and shit all over the place. It's really humbling. If you ever get the chance to visit the Capitol, I highly recommend anyone who can do so. It's really humbling. I think it makes you realize how human and small the system is, in a way that's very sort of, you know, you think of it as like this big implacable thing. You realize, you know, it's just a bunch of people. I mean, it's just a bunch of, you know, in a lot of respects, there's a bunch of jerk offs. You know, there's the famous Soprano. I don't know if it's famous, but I don't know why I said that. Anyway, there's this quote that is neither famous nor not famous from The Sopranos. Great show. And in The Sopranos, there's these two mobsters that are trying to kill some guy out in like the woods of New Jersey, and they get lost and stuck in the woods. Their car's dead. They got no cell phone connection, and it's really cold. They're freezing. And one of the mobsters is like a capo, and the other guy isn't. And they're talking, and the capo, the one who isn't a capo, goes to like do something, and the capo's like, "Hey, no, don't do that." And it's like, "Go fuck yourself." He's like, "Don't you know I'm a captain?" And it's Christian. He goes, "Polly, captain or no captain, right now we're just two jerk offs lost in the woods." And that's very much how I feel something about Congress. Is the reality is it's just a bunch of motherfuckers that are just the normal people, just like you and me. And so it's a really humbling experience to go and actually see the actual like physical stuff. Realize like, oh wow, you know, this is where, you know, Nancy Pelosi like, you know, stands up and goes to the metal detector just like an airport, you know, just like everyone else.
Do you happen to know like when the January 6th stuff happened? Is this like their escape route?
Yeah, that's my assumption, but I don't know. That'd be a good thing to see if someone could go Google.
When the government shut down, it means that the House of Representatives or the Senate are exercising the one constitutional power that we know we have, which is the power of the purse. If we disagree with the president on any kind of legislation, the only way we can actually affect that change is through the power of the purse.
Shut down the government, I know who's going to get blamed. Right. You know, the Republicans are going to get blamed. And secondly, the president's never going to sign this. It's not even going to get through the Senate. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. So this is not going to work. We are playing right into their hands. They've got these shit-eating grins on their face. I mean, really? Well, next thing I know, I'm reminded of the old adage when you're the leader. A leader without followers is simply a man taking a walk. I look up and all my colleagues are going this way. So I said, okay, fine. I get out in front of them. I led the effort.
I and my members decided that the threat of Obamacare and what was happening was so important that it was time for us to take a stand.
Le shutdown, vous le savez, aux États-Unis, les Américains.
美国联邦政府由于无法就新财年预算案达成一致而关闭的情况。
The federal government of the United States of America is closed.
At midnight last night, for the first time in 17 years,
October in 2013, this is within spitting distance, probably, 40 days, positive or negative, of Xi Jinping making his moves in the CCP. I believe it was 2011 when he was first elected, and it was 2013 when he did his first really big crackdown on quote-unquote anti-corruption, one of his first power moves to really take over the party. And we're doing this!
The war between these
awesome.
two parties had now evolved to the point where Republicans were not only trying to roll back everything President Obama had passed.
Are you trying to imply that we should have done something to stop him, or?
I mean, I feel like we should have been doing something to sort of get ourselves on par in the international stage with China. I mean, yeah, we're not going to be like, no, Xi Jinping, you can't arrest these people internally. But it's part of it is the grass is always greener, but sometimes it's really easy to lament, all the stupid shit we waste time on in the American system of government, while, the Chinese are, making really big moves to try and, become the next world superpower. I think Destiny's talked about this before. It's the idea of, like, China has their Belt and Road Initiative, where, they'll let, foreigners get these big, foreign countries get these big programs sort of bankrolled by the Chinese government, like ports in Sri Lanka and stuff like this, or letting people in these impoverished countries come to Chinese universities for free. And Destiny always says, oh man, if we did that in America, in like 5 seconds, there'd be conservatives be like, well, why can't we do that for our own people? And stuff like this.
Yeah, as far as like the thing about China specifically, I'm not sure I find that super persuasive, but on the bigger point, I definitely agree with you that like the world keeps moving. There's lots of other stuff we could be dealing with in the meantime, and just the internal functioning of our government is sometimes so inefficient that...
Yeah, and we just waste so much time on internal issues that really don't matter. Yeah, it's not like there's anything in 2013 where it's like, we could have made a critical move here or there, but it's just...
Well, was Ukraine 2014?
Yeah. Maybe in a year. But yeah, it's just the general attentiveness to these kinds of issues are what dominate our politics, instead of questions of like, well, what are we going to do with the rise of China and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's, if this is 2013, I think we're only 1 year out then, 2014, from when TPP is officially killed and dies, which would, I mean, if we could have got TPP...
I thought during maybe you're right, because I was going to say, like, I remember there was a bunch of discussion about TPP in 2016, but were they just talking about whether to revive it?
In 2016, Trump would talk about how Clinton had supported TPP and how she had changed. By 2016, Clinton said she was not a fan of TPP, and Trump would always beat her over the head. Oh, she said she does support TPP now, but that's because I did. It might have been 2015 or maybe even early 2016 that when TPP officially did die, but we're really close to that here. I mean, speaking of things that would have helped against China, I mean, that would have just put us light years ahead.
Hire government down to do it.
In other words, they demanded ransom just for doing their job.
The president says he won't negotiate with terrorists or with the Tea Party.
We cannot allow a handful of right-wing extremists to hold this nation hostage.
That's interesting. Bernie Sanders here, Democrat Vermont. I think at 2013 he was still an independent. I guess maybe they're using the fact that he is currently a Democrat.
He caucuses with the Democratic Party or something.
Maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. That'll be something to look at.
Right-wing extremists to hold this nation hostage.
Now, the result of this game of political chicken was total government shutdown, costing billions upon billions of dollars, loss of social services, and the government that the taxpayers of America were paying for that had literally ceased to function.
We want jobs, not furloughs.
800,000 federal workers going home without a paycheck.
I'm going to have to dig into my savings to pay my mortgage.
Congress needs to be turned over somebody's knee and spanked real hard because they're acting like small children.
I'm very disappointed in a system that I think is broken.
Now, the government shutdown did exactly what Speaker Boehner thought it would.
A poll conducted by the Associated Press this week shows Congress, the approval rating, has dropped to just 5%. It's the lowest level ever.
It brought on...
Just to clarify, I just looked it up. So Bernie Sanders is still, to this day, officially an independent, but caucuses with the Senate, House and Senate Democrats.
Massive anger towards Congress, and in particular the Republicans, who were seen as its instigators.
But after 16 days, I walked in and I said, all right, this nonsense is over. I get a standing ovation. This is the craziest thing I ever saw.
So it was like letting a kid touch the fire.
Oh, yeah, but for 16 days, we look like idiots.
Right.
We had enough Democrats with a few Republicans of goodwill allowed us to open the government again and save the country's name in the international community.
Now, the widespread unpopularity of the government shutdown seemed to have no effect on the continued rise of the more conservative Tea Party.
Breaking tonight, a stunning defeat on primary night as one of the most powerful Republicans on Capitol Hill goes down.
Good afternoon. Effective July 31st, I will be stepping down as majority leader.
Well, we get to the middle of 2014, and Eric Cantor, my number 2 guy, the majority leader, loses his primary election. Shocking.
Dave Bratt was outspent by his powerful rival 25-1.
Dollars do not vote. You do.
He won because he harnessed this anger with an establishment that has failed to deliver on any of their promises. Republicans promising that they were going to do all of these things, like repeal Obamacare and cut deficits, was never going to happen because the president wasn't going to work with them to do that.
Now, despite the fact that Cantor and Boehner were both conservative Republicans who were seen by the Democrats as fiercely partisan for failing to make deals with the executive, they were actually considered too nonpartisan by their own party for working with the Democrats at all.
This stuff is one of, I think, the biggest cancers right now in politics. And you hear it on both sides, the dinos and the rhinos. It's part of the reason why I, even though I disagree with a lot of his opinions, I hate all the attacks on Joe Manchin a lot of the times from people. Especially if you don't have any appreciation for what it is, the fact that it's a miracle, frankly, that there even is a Democratic senator in West Virginia in the first place. But yeah, the idea that because you're a member of our party, you have to, do this or do that, is a real cancer in politics, especially when explicitly our system isn't supposed to be like that. It's funny, the Tea Party people would say something like, well, we're gonna separate from what the conservative establishment wants. We're gonna do our own thing, even though we're part of the Republican Party. But then when other people want to do their own thing inside the Republican Party, oh, well, hold on, you're not allowed to break in that way. We're doing a good break. We're breaking to represent what the people really want. But, you doing that, well, that's just not allowed whatsoever. It's funny, just in comparison, especially to the electoral system in Canada, where political parties are much more hierarchical. I think it is in Canada that if you that the leader of the party can just sack anyone who's in the national legislature if they step out of line. If Justin Trudeau wanted, he could just fire any seated member of the legislature that was of the Liberal Party, and the same for Pierre Poilievre or Jagmeet Singh for the Conservatives and NDP.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this video, where you were saying the gridlock within the government is kind of reflecting the the gridlock within the public at large. If it's true that these politicians are just receiving huge amounts of backlash from their own supporters whenever they do any kind of compromise, then yeah, there's the incentive structure at work.
Yep.
And as such, both were ousted.
John Boehner made the mistake of listening too much to his golfing buddies and his drinking buddies and his smoking buddies instead of listening to what we wanted to do as members of Congress.
So this morning I informed my colleagues that I would resign from the speakership.
As if he would have done better to listen to that guy.
It's really interesting when you sit back and look at what the so-called Tea Party is. I was a Tea Party before there was a Tea Party.
Yep, and, the Republican Revolution with Newt Gingrich way back in the day.
And then all of a sudden I was the establishment. And I went to Washington to fight for a smaller, less costly, and more accountable federal government.
Live by the sword, die by the sword.
The only thing we disagreed on were tactics. You know, they were ready to burn the place down to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish.
Man, yeah, this is another thing where it's like you replace the proper nouns here, and this is like an anarcho-syndicalist describing their Twitter fight with like the Vosh section of RedTube or something. Like it's really funny how this stuff is truly transcends political aisles sometimes.
I thought burning the place down was probably not in the best interest of the party or the country.
Republicans will control both houses of Congress.
And we are going to make them squeal.
Now, the 2014 midterm elections brought another landslide victory for Republican candidates. They not only increased their numbers in the House, they also retook the Senate.
It's time to turn this country around.
Mitch McConnell, a notorious partisan hardliner, became the new Senate Majority Leader, making it virtually impossible for the president to work with Congress on almost anything.
Senate Republicans made it official there will be no hearings and no vote on anyone President Obama nominates for the Supreme Court.
This appointment should be made by the next president.
Including critical issues like filling an empty Supreme Court seat, reducing carbon emissions, or dealing with gun violence.
What worries me is whether the institutions that we've built are going to be adapted fast enough to meet the challenges that we face. Because I do believe that if we continue to have a situation in which, on an issue like gun safety measures, the majority agrees with it, but because members of Congress are much more concerned about a passionate minority of NRA members than they are about the general welfare, in those circumstances, I could see people getting more and more frustrated with our politics.
In the wake of the mass shooting in Orlando, that frustration boiled over into Congress.
We're calling on the leadership of the House to bring common sense gun control legislation to the House floor. Give us a vote.
More common sense.
Republicans blocked a gun control measure. Democrats in the House, which doesn't have filibuster rules.
Man, and up here, Paul Ryan, who I think is out at this point. I think he's dipped out pretty quickly. Not even by this point. God, I want to say like 2018 or something. He dipped out very quickly. Just another short-lived, guy trying to control the fucking uncontrollable, House of Representatives full of all these Tea Party hardliners. Another guy who just totally got it. It'll be curious to see how Kevin McCarthy fares. The next successor here. I believe Paul Ryan was our last Republican Speaker of the House. I believe it's been Nancy Pelosi since then. We'll see how Kevin McCarthy tries to handle that bouncing act.
I'm not optimistic, to be honest.
A cue from the Occupy Wall Street movement and actually occupied the House floor.
Why do you want to let terrorists buy a gun?
Making the government look less like a governing body and more like a kindergarten schoolyard.
I think that was in reference to the no-fly list. I'm just going to put this out there, guys. The no-fly list is a horrible piece of shit, a busted-up piece of shit. I believe there was a U.S. senator, a U.S. House of Representatives who was on the no-fly list and couldn't get removed. So he had to always take the train or something to get to Washington and stuff like this. It's a really, really bad list.
You essentially are punished without a trial. It's a list that I forget. Is it the FBI that maintains it or something?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, and they can just decide to put you on it, with basically no recourse.
Yep.
In the middle of a shouting match. Now, the 114th Congress has been one of the least effective ever. Not only has it been gridlocked on hot-button issues like gun control, but it's also failed to provide adequate responses to emergencies like the Flint water crisis, the threat of the Zika virus, and the opioid addiction epidemic. In 2016, it narrowly avoided another government shutdown, and the Senate is on track to work the fewest days in 60 years. Washington is now toxic, and it seems to be galvanized into inactivity.
That's not the way politics used to be. Now, they don't even know each other.
I'm waiting on you. I've been very patient.
Your state is a crazy state to begin with, and I mean that just
Okay, you're in Florida, bro. Come on now. Let's calm down here.
as I said it.
Mr. Chairman, I am not delaying. I'm making an extremely important point.
There's a segment of the Republican Party that would rather blow everything up than try to fix it. And they believe that they're acting with principle. But principle is not the be-all and end-all.
As a junior senator, I preside over the Senate. I usually do it in the morning, which means I'm forced to listen to the bitter, vulgar, incoherent ramblings of the minority leader.
It is a blood sport. It is how much damage can I do to you? How much can I destroy your reputation?
I think you are an ignorant bigot.
How can I hurt you so much that not only are you destroyed, but your dead relatives in the old country can feel it?
I don't know what the deal was. Well, I'm going to tell a senator. I guarantee you. I'm going to tell a senator the deal. I'm going to tell a senator the deal.
You fucked up. You killed the goose that laid the golden egg. You fucked it up. Nobody's listening. Nobody's learning. It's all just one big gab fest.
If it's toxic and it can't be fixed, where does American politics go from here?
That's why I tell people I'm going to New Zealand and I'm going to buy 15 acres somewhere and I'll sell off 14. So if you want to buy an acre, let me know. I'm not kidding.
Right.
I'm going in December.
Wow.
At some point, the economy just stops functioning. The Greeks did not survive. The Romans did not survive. The French did not survive. The British did not survive. Why should we think the American empire will survive? I don't know. And I, unfortunately, will probably still be alive. I wish I wasn't, when this whole thing comes tumbling down.
Leaving office soon. 2 terms. A lot of partisan politics, a lot of fighting, known for that. It seems as if it will become even more polarizing. Where do you see politics going?
We have some structural problems in our politics more broadly that are creating greater polarization. And that until we change those, whoever the occupant here is going to confront some of the same
How do you change
patterns. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. The fact that our media has gotten so splintered. Well, as recently as Bill Clinton's presidency, certainly with Ronald Reagan's presidency, the majority of people still consume their news from the nightly networks. And you had common basis of facts. And today, anybody with access to a website has an opinion.
Obama and Hillary both smell like sulfur. They smell like hell.
Can we pause for a second? I really strongly agree with what the point that Obama's making there, which is I think the kind of balkanization of media is a humongous contributor to this, the whole like partisan divide that this documentary is about.
Yeah, it's just when people are living in different realities, it's no wonder that they can't agree on anything.
Yeah, and like, you know, even if we're all living in the same media environment, the same reality, there's a price to pay for that too, like, right? I mean, it's like in some sense where if we're all drinking the same Kool-Aid or whatever, if I want to put it in the worst way possible, right? But nevertheless, at least that scenario does not result in the crazy infighting that characterizes our politics today.
Yep.
Fact-impaired miniverse.
Barack Obama is destroying the United States economy.
The Republicans are only concerned about what's on Fox News or what Rush Limbaugh's saying, and Democrats are looking at the New York Times or Huffington Post.
How are you still on national TV and just said that black people are prone to criminality? Okay. Well, they are.
I don't know you, and I don't want to talk to you.
Now, the fragmentation of news media is one area where the president and Speaker Boehner agree.
And not only have you got all these cable channels, and all they do is politics all day long. And then all of a sudden you got Facebook, and you got Twitter. The American people are choosing, where they get their news. A lot of people get their news from talk radio. That'll scare the hell out of anybody. People are being bombarded with information about their government. 100 times more so than what we saw, in the early 90s. Maybe 1,000 times more. It's pushed or pulled Americans to the right, pushed and pulled to the left.
Occupy Wall Street!
Leaving fewer and fewer people in the middle. Members of Congress represent their constituents. of a sudden their constituents are going way left or going way right, making it almost impossible to get anything done.
Now, the frustration with Washington's dysfunction only encourages the idea that any attempt at bipartisan consensus governance is actually a waste of time, and that the only way to accomplish your goals is to threaten to blow up the entire system.
Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it.
Which in turn gave rise to a presidential contest that was dominated by hyper-partisan political heckling instead of serious policy debate.
She's a world-class liar.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Hillary Clinton is a bigot.
He is temperamentally unfit.
Is she crooked? Is she crooked?
Donald Trump's taken what I think is the spirit of our country and our party, and he's abandoned that for the oldest game in politics, demagoguery and scapegoating.
And we will keep radical Islamic terrorists the hell out of our country.
On the Republican side, they end up voting for the one guy who has no political experience whatsoever.
Well, why?
Because they hated Barack Obama so much that they wanted to vote for the antidote.
I believed in government. I believed in the system working, but Barack Hussein Obama has used his status in this country to be a dictator.
Is Trump the anti-Barack Obama?
Absolutely. Obama's smooth and Trump is rough. Obama's calm and Trump is hot. Obama is intellectual, Trump is emotional. You could not get someone more different than Barack Obama than Donald Trump.
Obama is the founder of ISIS. The founder.
We can't afford to give
I forgot about that one.
votes to someone so erratic.
We're going to have real change, not Obama change.
Donald Trump is someone who is representing an outsider's view as to what's going on here in Washington. People are very, very angry. And so Donald Trump comes in and he says, look, I'm not a part of any of that stuff. I'm a deal maker. I can get things done. And I think that's a very appealing message, especially when you're running against somebody like Hillary Clinton, who represents the epitome of what this town of Washington is about.
She's been doing this for 30 years, and you do have experience. I'd say the one thing you have over me is experience, but it's bad experience, because what you've done has turned out badly.
The American people, specifically the Republicans, they wanted somebody to either change Washington or blow it up.
It has been a stunning night. It has been a historic night. He won Florida. He won Ohio. He won Wisconsin.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States, Donald Trump.
It is time for us to come together as one united people.
In one of the biggest upsets in American political history, Donald Trump won the White House while the GOP retained control over the House and the Senate.
The people have spoken. Donald Trump will be the next president, the 45th president of the United States. Those who didn't vote for him have to recognize that that's how democracy works. That's how this system operates.
So upon assuming office, he will have the legislative power to push his agenda through without the participation of the Democrats, much like the power Obama had in 2008. And Trump will be able to name at least one new Supreme Court justice, tilting the balance of the court, which is currently gridlocked, for some time to come. Now add to this his many campaign promises to dismantle the Democrats' initiatives, such as the Affordable Care Act, climate regulations, and trade deals, which in effect would wipe out the last 8 years of governance. Now all of this comes actually after losing the popular vote, which is almost a guarantee for continued partisanship, anger, and frustration. Only this time for the other half of the country.
You know, the one thing I've learned in this job is that I have really progressive policy beliefs, but I'm more conservative when it comes to our institutions. I've seen enough around the world when it comes to the results of complete revolution or upheaval, to know that it doesn't always play out real well. You know, our founders had this incredible wisdom to create a basic structure that works to bring about change in a big, diverse, complicated society like ours. And I think those values and those institutions are worth preserving.
Well, I just had the opportunity to have...
Meanwhile, it's funny to show Abraham Lincoln as the example of that. A guy who had to fight a war that killed 600,000 people to get change accomplished in a big, diverse society. I don't know if that's the example you really should be looking after. But.
Our system has a lot of benefits, but I think it's telling. When we go try and build democracies abroad, we don't tell them to build our system. we tell them to build some sort of parliamentary system with a prime minister who is, represents whichever party holds the most seats. American system has a lot of benefits, and I do love America. I think it's the greatest country in the history of the planet, but it's not perfect, like many things.
Going back to your first question, you asked me, had I changed Washington? The answer is I have not changed Washington the way I wanted to change it. And what I worry about in our politics is people getting impatient with the slowness of democracy, and the less effective Congress works, the more likely people are, I think, to start giving up on some of the core values and basic institutions that have helped us to weather a lot of storms.
Not the greatest, happy of endings, but there you go.
Yeah. So there's the backdrop to our last few years of politics. I don't know. Anything else you want to add, either about the documentary or about the elections yesterday or anything like?
No, I think. Excuse me. I think this basically hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is the core problem with our politics: is that our politicians are representing the people, and the people are really fucking angry. They're angry, they're divided, they're upset about a lot of different things. And as long as that's going to be the case, this is what our politics are going to look like. I think the real devil in the details is how do we make people less angry and less divided, when it seems like everyone almost wants to be angry, wants to be divided, and wants to keep using the things that make them angry and divided, which I think the sort of blame lies squarely on social media. Human beings, we just, we were designed for chasing down lions and shit. This stuff is kind of a different ball game. But hey, hopefully in, 5-10 years, the thing I always say, and maybe it's a bit of copium, but if social media were cars, we would be in the stage where we haven't yet invented seatbelts and airbags. So hopefully, in 5-10 years, we come up with some invention that is, the seatbelt or the airbag of social media. Something that's very safe, very good at reducing the dangers, very obvious in hindsight, very easy to do. Maybe the fact that we're now having children raised by parents who themselves are gripped with social media for their entirety of their lives will be a big game changer as well. But ultimately, who knows what the future holds, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the thing that we have to hope for is that, some unprecedented thing in the future solves this problem, right? Because under current conditions, even something like COVID wasn't able to unite us, something that seems like it should be the obvious enemy of all of humanity. Yep. And nevertheless, that turned into a partisan bickering feud. So like the way that we communicate with each other just needs to change on a fairly deep level in order for these problems to change significantly. But anyway, thanks for joining us. Do you want to shout out your social media and stuff?
Yep, I'm Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace, no longer an underscore there. I'm going to be on a show tomorrow at, I believe it's going to be 10 p.m. Eastern. Something called Social Truth. Apparently, I'm going to be playing a character. So, and I'm going to have to be arguing on a panel where I play a specific character, the specific political position. So, sounds pretty interesting. I just got added to it kind of out of the blue, but I'm looking forward to it.
That sounds really interesting. Is that on Twitch?
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be on Social Truth, twitch.tv/fbombs4, as in the number UYOU.
Nice. That's a really interesting idea. I've been thinking for a long time that I wish there were more innovation in the way that Twitch works, and I don't know. I'm very curious to see how it goes. I'll try to remember to ask you about that next week. But anyway, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week.
See you then.